My name is Scott Turner, and before that Wednesday evening, I would have described my life as typical, maybe even enviable. At 33, I was married to Melissa, my college sweetheart, and we had a bright, curious 6-year-old daughter named Emily. I worked long hours as a regional manager for a logistics company, a job that kept me away from home more than I liked, but it paid the bills and allowed Melissa to stay home with Emily. We lived in a modest house in a quiet suburb. It wasn't perfect. There were always bills to pay, and the lawn needed constant attention. But it was ours. On most days, I considered myself lucky. That Wednesday started like any other. I woke up before dawn, slipped out of bed quietly to avoid waking Melissa, and grabbed a quick breakfast before heading to work. The drive to the office was uneventful, and the day passed in a blur of meetings, emails, and the endless grind that had become my routine. When I got home that evening, the house smelled faintly of spaghetti and garlic bread. Emily's favorite meal. She was at the dining room table, her crayons scattered around her as she worked on one of her endless masterpieces. "Hey, Pumpkin," I said, dropping my briefcase by the door. "Hi, Daddy," she chirped, her face lighting up as she looked up from her drawing. Her blonde hair was pulled into two messy pigtails, and there was a smudge of purple crayon on her cheek. Melissa appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Welcome home," she said with a warm smile. "Dinner's almost ready." I kissed her on the cheek, grateful for the simple comfort of coming home to my family. "What are you drawing, Em?" I asked, moving to stand behind her. "It's a picture of Mommy and her friend," Emily said brightly, her small hands working quickly to add details to the scene. Her words didn't register at first. "Mommy's friend?" I asked absently, glancing down at the paper. Emily nodded, holding up the drawing proudly. "Yeah, the man who visited last week when you were at work." My stomach tightened. On the paper, Emily had drawn two stick figures, one labeled Mommy and the other Man. They were standing in what was clearly our living room, with Emily's stuffed unicorn visible in the corner. I glanced at Melissa, who had gone still, her smile frozen on her face. "What is she talking about?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. Melissa laughed nervously, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Oh, you know how kids are. She probably just imagined something." "Right, Em." Emily frowned, looking genuinely confused. "No, Mommy. Remember? The man with the big hat who came over and brought me a candy bar?" I felt my heart rate spike. "Melissa," I said, my tone firmer now. "Who is she talking about?" Melissa hesitated, the color draining from her face. "It was just a delivery guy," she said quickly. "He must have been extra friendly or something. You know how kids latch on to things." "Delivery guys don't usually hang out in the living room," I said, my eyes narrowing. Emily looked back and forth between us, sensing the tension. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, her voice small. "No, sweetheart," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "You didn't do anything wrong." Melissa cleared her throat, taking a step toward Emily. "Why don't you go wash up for dinner, Em? Daddy and I need to talk for a minute." Emily hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave her drawing, but Melissa gave her a gentle nudge. "Go on," she said, her voice softer now. As soon as Emily was out of earshot, I turned to Melissa. "What the hell is going on?" Melissa crossed her arms defensively. "Nothing is going on, Scott. She's just a kid. She probably saw someone outside and made up a story about it. You know how active her imagination is." I stared at her, my gut telling me there was more to this than she was letting on. "Emily doesn't lie," I said slowly. "She's never made up something this detailed before." Melissa looked away, her jaw tightening. "I don't know what to tell you," she said, her tone clipped. "There's nothing to worry about." But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of guilt, or maybe fear, that made my stomach churn. I didn't press her further that night, partly because I didn't want to upset Emily, and partly because I needed time to think. But as I lay awake in bed later, staring at the ceiling while Melissa pretended to sleep beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the picture Emily had drawn was more than just an innocent piece of art. It was the first crack in the foundation of my carefully constructed life, and I had a sinking feeling that, once the cracks started to spread, there would be no stopping them. The next morning started quietly, but the tension in the house was palpable. Melissa acted as if nothing had happened the night before, humming softly to herself as she made breakfast. Emily chattered happily about school while munching on a piece of toast, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. I couldn't stop thinking about the drawing. It sat in my briefcase now, folded neatly but heavy with implications. Every time I glanced at Melissa, the image resurfaced in my mind. The stick figures labeled Mommy and Man, standing together in our living room. The picture wasn't just a child's scribble anymore. It was a puzzle piece, and I couldn't ignore it. "Do you have a lot of work today?" Melissa asked casually as she placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of me. "Usual stuff," I replied, keeping my tone even. "What about you? Any plans?" She shook her head. "Just the normal errands. Grocery shopping, maybe stopping by the dry cleaners. Nothing exciting." I nodded, watching her closely. Her voice was steady, her smile warm, but something about her felt off. I'd been married to Melissa long enough to know her tells, the way she avoided eye contact when she was nervous, the faint tremble in her hands when she was hiding something. I wanted to confront her again, to demand the truth, but Emily's presence at the table made it impossible. Instead, I forced myself to go through the motions of breakfast, kissed Emily goodbye, and left for work. Or at least, that's what I let Melissa think. Once I was out of the driveway, I pulled over a few blocks away, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't just let this go. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them by sitting in my office pretending everything was fine. I turned the car around and parked a few houses down from ours, out of sight but close enough to keep an eye on the house. I felt ridiculous, like some paranoid husband in a bad soap opera, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't let me ignore what was happening. For the next few hours, I sat there, alternating between staring at the house and scrolling through my phone. Melissa left around mid-morning, just like she said she would, carrying her purse and a reusable grocery bag. I followed her at a distance, careful not to get too close. She went to the grocery store, then the dry cleaners, just as she'd mentioned over breakfast. For a moment, I felt foolish, like I was chasing shadows. Maybe I really was overreacting. Maybe Emily's drawing was just the product of a vivid imagination, like Melissa said. But then she made an unscheduled stop. Melissa pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe on the edge of town, a cozy little spot we'd gone to a few times for brunch. I parked a safe distance away and watched as she walked inside, her posture stiff and her expression tense. Minutes later, a man joined her at the table. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a baseball cap, the kind that might look nondescript to most people, but it immediately reminded me of Emily's words, "the man with the big hat." My heart sank as I watched them together. They weren't overtly affectionate, no touching, no leaning in too close, but there was an ease between them that felt too familiar for two casual acquaintances. Melissa smiled at something he said, and he laughed, his hand resting briefly on the table between them. I snapped a few photos with my phone, my hands trembling. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly. Proof? Evidence? All I knew was that I couldn't leave without documenting what I was seeing. They stayed for about 40 minutes before Melissa stood, slinging her purse over her shoulder. The man stood as well, and for a moment I thought they might leave together. But instead, he gave her a small nod, and they went their separate ways. Melissa heading back to the car, and the man disappearing down the street. I waited until Melissa drove off before starting my car, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Part of me wanted to confront her the moment she walked through the door. Another part wanted to track down the man and demand answers from him, but a quieter, more rational voice in the back of my mind told me to wait. I needed more information before I made any decisions. That evening, Melissa acted like nothing was amiss. She chatted about her errands, helped Emily with her homework, and curled up on the couch with me after Emily went to bed, her head resting on my shoulder. But all I could think about was the cafe, the man, and the lies she might be telling me without saying a word. When she finally went to bed, I stayed behind in the living room, staring at the photos on my phone. The image of Melissa sitting across from the man burned into my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The cracks in our life were widening, and I didn't know how much longer the foundation could hold. The next day at work, I was useless. My focus flickered between half-hearted attempts at answering emails and staring at the photos I'd taken of Melissa and the man at the cafe. Every time I looked at their blurred figures seated across from each other, a wave of anger and sadness crashed over me. Who was he? What was he to her? And why had she kept him hidden from me? Around lunchtime, I decided I couldn't sit in limbo anymore. I needed answers. But if I confronted Melissa again without solid proof, I knew she'd just brush it off like before. I had to be smarter. I scrolled through my contacts and called Adam, an old college buddy of mine who worked as a private investigator. We hadn't spoken much in recent years, but I knew he was good at what he did, and I trusted him. "Scott Turner," he answered, his voice laced with amusement. "To what do I owe the honor?" "Don't tell me you're finally hiring me to find your stolen lunch from sophomore year." "Not exactly," I said, managing a weak chuckle. "I need your help with something personal." The tone of his voice shifted instantly. "What's going on?" "I think Melissa might be seeing someone," I admitted, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "There's this guy. I don't know who he is, but Emily mentioned him, and I saw them together at a cafe yesterday. I took some photos, but that's all I've got right now." Adam was silent for a moment, then said, "Okay, I can look into it. Send me the photos and whatever details you have, times, places, anything. I'll start there." "Thanks, man," I said, relief flooding through me. "Don't thank me yet," Adam replied. "Let's find out what we're dealing with first." That evening, I was unusually quiet at home, my thoughts consumed by the investigation I'd set in motion. Melissa noticed, of course. "You okay?" she asked as we sat at the dinner table, her tone casual but laced with concern. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a long day at work." She nodded, accepting the excuse without pressing further. But I could feel her watching me, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. Guilt? Suspicion? Emily, oblivious to the tension between us, was her usual bubbly self. She told us about her day at school, her latest art project, and a new friend she'd made on the playground. I clung to her stories like a lifeline, grateful for the brief distraction from the storm brewing in my mind. After dinner, Melissa went upstairs to put Emily to bed, and I took the opportunity to check my phone. Adam had already texted me. "Adam, got the photos. Recognize the guy. He's been in and out of some shady stuff. Business dealings mostly, but nothing concrete. I'll dig deeper. Shady dealings." The phrase sent a shiver down my spine. What the hell was Melissa involved in? When she came back downstairs, I was careful to act normal, even as my mind raced with questions. We sat on the couch together, the TV playing some crime drama she liked, but I barely registered it. My thoughts were elsewhere. Later that night, when she was asleep, I crept into the living room and opened my laptop. I couldn't just sit and wait for Adam's updates. I needed to take matters into my own hands. I started with her phone records. Melissa wasn't particularly tech-savvy, and it wasn't hard to log into our shared phone account. The call logs showed nothing unusual, mostly calls to me, Emily's school, and her mom. But the text messages were a different story. There was a number I didn't recognize with no name attached to it that appeared multiple times over the past few months. The messages themselves weren't visible due to privacy settings, but the sheer frequency of them set off alarm bells. I copied the number and sent it to Adam, along with a quick note. "This might be something. Can you check it out?" The next day, Adam called me while I was at work. "Scott, I've got something," he said without preamble. I felt my heart rate spike. "What is it?" "The number you sent me belongs to a guy named Brian Connors. He's involved in a lot of questionable businesses, real estate scams, offshore accounts, you name it. But here's the kicker. He's married." "Married?" I repeated, stunned. "Yeah, his wife filed for divorce last year, citing infidelity, but it never went through. Word is he's got a reputation for charming women. Looks like Melissa might be his latest target." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I struggled to process what Adam was telling me. If Brian was married and a known liar, what the hell was Melissa doing with him? "Thanks, Adam," I said quietly. "Listen," Adam said, his tone gentler now. "I know this isn't easy, but you need to be careful. Guys like this don't just hurt marriages. They leave destruction in their wake. You need to figure out what you want to do before this gets worse." I nodded even though he couldn't see me. "Yeah, I'll figure it out." That night, I couldn't bring myself to look at Melissa. Every glance at her felt like staring at a stranger. The cracks in our life were no longer subtle. They were jagged and gaping, threatening to swallow everything I thought I knew. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending everything was fine. The weight of what I'd learned hung over me like a dark cloud. Brian Connors, a man with a reputation for deceit, who might be married himself, was the person Melissa had been texting and meeting. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they painted was something I wasn't ready to face. That night, after Emily was tucked into bed and the house fell silent, I sat across from Melissa in the living room. She was scrolling through her phone absent-mindedly, the soft glow of the screen illuminating her face. "Melissa," I said, my voice firmer than I intended. She looked up, startled. "Yeah? We need to talk." Her eyes flickered with hesitation, but she set her phone down and straightened in her seat. "Okay. About what?" I leaned forward, clasping my hands together to steady them. "Who is Brian Connors?" Her reaction was immediate, a slight widening of her eyes, the faintest hitch in her breath. She quickly masked it with confusion, but I'd already seen the crack in her composure. I I don't know who that is," she said, forcing a laugh. "Why would you ask me that?" "Don't lie to me, Melissa," I said, my voice low but steady. "I know you've been texting him. I know you've met with him. And I know this has been going on for months." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her hands twisted nervously in her lap, and I could see her mind racing for an explanation. "Emily mentioned him first," I continued, not giving her a chance to deflect. "She drew a picture of you and the man who visited while Daddy was at work. Then I saw you with him at the cafe. Do you want to keep denying it, or are you finally going to tell me the truth?" Melissa's shoulders slumped, and she let out a shaky breath. "It's not what you think," she said softly. "Then tell me what it is," I demanded. For a long moment, she was silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Brian is someone I met through a friend," she admitted. "At first it was innocent. He's a real estate consultant, and I wanted advice about refinancing the house while you were so busy with work. That's all it was in the beginning." "In the beginning?" I echoed bitterly. "And now?" Her eyes filled with tears as she looked up at me. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she said, her voice breaking. "I swear, Scott. I was just, I was lonely. You're always at work, and I felt like we were drifting apart. Brian was, he was there. He listened. He made me feel seen." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "So what? You decided that gave you the right to invite him into our home? To let him around our daughter?" Melissa flinched, fresh tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't like that," she insisted. "He came over once, maybe twice, but it was never physical. I never wanted to hurt you or Emily." "Never wanted to hurt us?" I snapped, rising from my seat. "Do you even hear yourself, Melissa? Do you understand what you've done?" "I made a mistake," she cried. "A terrible mistake, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I love you, Scott. I love our family. Please don't let this destroy everything we've built." I turned away, running a hand through my hair as I tried to process her words. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this was just a lapse in judgment, that we could move past it somehow. But the image of her sitting across from Brian, smiling at him the way she used to smile at me, was seared into my mind. "I need time," I said finally, my voice hoarse. Melissa stood, desperation etched into her features. "Please, Scott, don't shut me out. Let's talk about this. Let's fix it." I shook my head, stepping toward the door. "I can't do this right now. I need to think." Before she could say anything else, I grabbed my keys and walked out, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. I drove aimlessly, my mind a whirlwind of emotions: anger, betrayal, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of loss. I thought about Emily, about how her innocent drawing had pulled back the curtain on Melissa's lies. She deserved better than this. We both did. Eventually, I found myself at Adam's place. He opened the door, taking one look at my face before stepping aside to let me in. "What happened?" he asked, handing me a beer as we sat in his living room. "She admitted it. I said, my voice hollow. She said she was lonely, that it started with some advice about refinancing the house. But it wasn't just that. She let him into our home, Adam, around Emily. Adam shook his head, his expression grim. I'm sorry, Scott. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. What do I do now? I asked, looking at him helplessly. How do I move forward from this? Adam leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment. That's up to you, he said finally. But whatever you decide, make sure it's what's best for you and Emily. Don't let her guilt you into staying if it's not what you want. His words lingered in my mind long after I left his house that night. As I sat in my car staring at the darkened streets, I realized that the cracks in my marriage weren't just about Melissa's betrayal. They were about trust, respect, and the future I wanted for myself and my daughter. And for the first time, I wondered if that future included Melissa at all. The next morning, I woke up on Adam's couch, my head pounding and my heart heavy. I had barely slept, my mind running in circles as I tried to figure out what to do. Adam had been supportive, but he couldn't make the decision for me. I had to decide for myself whether to try to salvage my marriage or to walk away. I left early, wanting to avoid any long conversations or pitying looks. The drive home was quiet, the usual chatter of the morning radio too much for me to handle. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw Melissa through the living room window, sitting on the couch with a mug of coffee in her hands. She looked like she hadn't slept either, her face pale and drawn. I stepped inside and the tension in the air hit me like a wall. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and swollen. You came back, she said softly. For Emily, I replied, setting my keys on the counter. Melissa flinched at the coldness in my tone, but she didn't argue. She's still asleep, she said, glancing toward the stairs. I thought we could talk. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Fine, let's talk. We sat across from each other in the living room, the silence between us heavy and oppressive. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air. I've told you everything, Melissa said finally, her voice trembling. There's nothing else to hide. I know I messed up, Scott, but I need you to understand. It was never about him. It was about me. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore. And when Brian came along, he made me feel noticed. Her words stung, but I kept my expression neutral. You could have told me that, I said, my voice tight. You could have talked to me instead of letting some stranger into our lives, into Emily's life. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know I should have, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I'm here now, Scott. I'm telling you the truth, and I'm begging you to give me a chance to make this right. I leaned back, staring at her. Do you even realize how much damage you've done? Emily trusts you. She looks up to you. And now, because of your choices, she's in the middle of something she doesn't even understand. Melissa's sobs grew louder, and she buried her face in her hands. I'll do anything, she choked out. Therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. Just tell me what I need to do. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we could fix this, that the life we had built together wasn't beyond saving. But every time I tried to picture a future with her, all I could see was the cafe, the texts, the lies. I don't know if I can do this, I admitted, my voice breaking. Her head snapped up, panic flashing in her eyes. Please, Scott, don't say that. Don't give up on us. We can get through this. I know we can. I need time to think, I said, standing abruptly. Scott, I need time, I repeated, cutting her off. And until I figure out what I want, I think it's best if we have some space. Her face crumpled, but she nodded. What does that mean? She asked, her voice barely audible. It means I'm staying at Adam's for a while, I said. I'll come by to see Emily, but I need to be away from this house. From you. Melissa didn't argue. She simply nodded again, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Okay, she whispered. If that's what you need. I packed a bag quickly, trying to avoid Emily's room so I wouldn't wake her. As I grabbed the last of my things, I paused by her door, listening to the soft sound of her breathing. My heart clenched at the thought of leaving her behind, even temporarily. When I stepped outside, the cool morning air hit me like a slap to the face. I stood there for a moment, staring at the house where my life had unraveled. It didn't feel like home anymore. At Adams, the days turned into a routine of numbness and overthinking. I spent my time between work, avoiding Melissa's messages, and trying to keep things normal for Emily during the visits we arranged. But no matter how much I tried to compartmentalize, the question kept coming back. Was this marriage worth saving? One evening, as I sat on Adam's porch with a beer in hand, he joined me, pulling up a chair. "You've been quiet," he said. I shrugged. "Still figuring things out." He took a sip of his drink, then leaned forward. "Have you talked to her again?" "Not really, just about Emily." Adam nodded. "And what about the other guy? Brian. Is he still in the picture?" "I don't think so," I said honestly. "She seems desperate to fix things." Adam studied me for a moment. "You've got two options, Scott. You either go back and try to work it out, or you move on. But dragging it out is only going to make things harder for you and for Emily." I knew he was right. I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. Melissa had made her choices, and now I had to make mine. The following days felt like the longest of my life. Every time I saw Emily, my heart broke a little more. She was too young to understand what was happening, but she wasn't oblivious. She would ask why I wasn't coming home, her wide, innocent eyes searching mine for answers I couldn't give her. "Did I do something bad, Daddy?" she asked one evening during one of our visits. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. "No, sweetheart," I said quickly, pulling her into my arms. "You didn't do anything wrong. Mommy and I just need some time to figure out a few things." She nodded against my chest, her little arms wrapping tightly around me. "I miss you," she whispered. "I miss you too," I replied, my voice breaking. When I left that evening, I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the house where Melissa was likely inside, waiting for me to make a decision. I thought about everything: Emily's drawing, Melissa's admission, the lies and the pain. And I thought about what Adam had said. I couldn't drag this out forever. I needed to decide. The next evening, I called Melissa and asked her to meet me at a nearby park. It was neutral ground, a place where we could talk without Emily overhearing. She agreed without hesitation, and when she arrived, I could see the hope in her eyes. We sat on a bench under the fading light of the setting sun, the distant sounds of kids playing on the playground filling the silence between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I've made a decision," I said finally, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. Melissa's hands clenched in her lap, her eyes searching mine. "Okay," she said softly. "I've thought about this from every angle," I began. "I've tried to imagine how we could move forward, how I could ever trust you again. But no matter how much I want to believe we could fix this, I can't get past what you've done." Her face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Scott, please." "Let me finish," I said gently but firmly. She nodded, her hands trembling. "This isn't just about the affair," I continued. "It's about the choices you made. Bringing that man into our home, around our daughter, lying to me for months. Those aren't mistakes, Melissa. Those are betrayals. And I can't build a life on a foundation that's cracked beyond repair." Melissa sobbed quietly, her head bowing as she covered her face with her hands. "I love you," she choked out. "I love our family. I'll do anything, Scott, anything to make it right." I swallowed the lump in my throat, fighting back my own tears. "I believe you love me," I said softly, "and I believe you're sorry. But love and regret aren't enough to undo what's been done. I can't live in a marriage where trust has been broken like this." She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "So that's it? You're just walking away?" "I'm not walking away," I said, my voice firm. "I'll always be there for Emily. I'll co-parent with you, and I'll do everything I can to make sure she feels loved and supported. But I can't stay in this marriage. It's over, Melissa." Her sobs grew louder, but she didn't argue. I think deep down she knew this was coming. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cracking. "I really am. But this is the best decision for me. For us." Melissa nodded slowly, wiping her tears with trembling hands. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "We'll figure it out," I said. "We'll talk to a lawyer, work out custody for Emily. I'll help you however I can, but we need to start moving forward, separately." She nodded again, staring at the ground. "I never meant for it to end like this," she whispered. Neither did I said. We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of finality settling over us. When the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood and offered her a hand. She hesitated before taking it, her grip weak but steady. "I'll always care about you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But we can't go back." She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I understand," she said. The days that followed were some of the hardest I'd ever endured. Telling Emily about the separation was gut-wrenching, her little face crumpling with confusion and sadness, as Melissa and I explained as gently as we could that Mommy and Daddy wouldn't be living together anymore. I moved into a small apartment across town, close enough to see Emily regularly, but far enough to start fresh. The silence in the apartment was deafening at first, but over time, I started to find peace in it. I threw myself into being the best father I could be for Emily. Every weekend we spent together, every bedtime story I read her over the phone, reminded me that she was my anchor, the reason I had to keep moving forward. Melissa and I kept our interactions civil, focused solely on Emily's well-being. Over time, the anger and bitterness began to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. Life didn't go back to normal, but it found a new rhythm. And in that rhythm, I found strength to heal, to grow, and to believe that one day I might build a new life, a better one, for both myself and Emily.